Tonight I am pleased to welcome back to Eudora Dr. David Katzman. Dr. Katzman's program tonight is called The History of Eudora's Jewish Community. Dr. Katzman last presented this program in Eudora back in March of 2011. It was actually the first program that I ever attended here in Eudora with the Historical Society. I thought it was a great program, and I figured that was 12 years ago, so we were long overdue to bring him back. Dr. Katzman, a Queens College, got his BA at Queens College and PhD at the University of Michigan, is a specialist in race, ethnicity, and religion. He directs the Kansas Jewish History Project and is a KU Professor Emeritus at the University of Kansas, where he held appointments in American Studies, History, African and African American Studies, and Jewish Studies. He has authored, co-authored, and edited 7 books and edited the journal American Studies for more than 3 decades. Dr. Katzman has held Guggenheim, NEH, and Ford and Rockefeller Foundation fellowships, as well as a Fulbright. He has been a visiting professor in Ireland, England, Japan, Hong Kong, China, and has lectured in Italy and Israel. He is an elected fellow of the Society of American Historians. He has received many awards locally and nationally for teaching, research, and mentoring of students. His most recent book, written with his sister Louise Karabi, was We Are Seattle, A Visual History of Our House, 2022. Dr. Katzman is a lifetime member of the Historical Society, and I appreciate his support of our organization, and I also appreciate the tremendous research he has done on Eudora's Jewish community, which has enriched our community so much. And I also, before I bring him up here, wanted to show this. Dr. Katzman gave this to the museum recently, which is a poem about the Beni Israel Cemetery here in Eudora. So if you're watching online, you can come to the museum sometime and read this. We'll have it on display for you. That's all I have. Please welcome Dr. Katzman.
Now, am I standing in the right place?
You are, yes.
Okay, and the big button is the one that I...
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll see these slides and I'll talk around the slides. And when we get to the slides, feel free to ask any questions or interrupt me or anything, because I hope that I prepared as an informal discussion. I want to thank Ben for inviting me back, and I've learned a lot more since I made a presentation earlier. I also had a chance to visit the museum, and I think Eudora is exceptional both in its local historical museum through the work of Ben and in its local history where the Wakarusa meets the core, which I think is a remarkable piece of local historical writing by Cindy Huggins. I appreciate how the Society's leadership has opened Eudora to appreciating its history and expanding on its history, and especially the diverse communities and individuals that have played a part in Eudora. I also want to thank Andrea Weiss, my collaborator on the Kansas Jewish History Project. Eudora, I think, was exceptional in Kansas in terms of its acceptance of the Jewish community and its recognition of the Jewish community. In my research on Eudora, which extends over a 10-year period, I have not encountered any examples of organized anti-Semitism in Eudora, which is unusual in terms of Kansas towns. Not that Kansas is dominant in that. It's been by and large a good place, but in most communities, especially with the Klan in the 1920s, there was overt public anti-Semitism. First of all, Jews were part of the Chicago founding company. Indeed, I think that that founding company was for Kansas much more diverse than other town settlements. Many of the communities were homogeneous, like the New England Immigrant Society, largely a Protestant group. Some of the foreign groups from Sweden and Holland and other places tended to be homogeneous. The group in Chicago, often referred to as a German group, was not a German group. To be more accurate, we would say it was a German-speaking group. There were many people in the area who would not identify as German, even though their first language was German. Most of the Jews came from an area in Germany that at the time was Prussia, but was referred to as Posen, and today we would say was part of Poland. And few of them, when you look at how they identify in the census or elsewhere, ever called themselves German. And that was not unique just to the Jewish settlers. There were many others who were part of Eudora who did not identify. So from the start, it was a much more diverse community than most of the towns in Kansas at the time. Jews were also accepted in the community from the start. So, and the first city council, Abraham Summerfield, whose grandson was named the Summerfield Hall at KU, was elected to the city council. And then in the 1860s, Adolph Erb was elected to the city council. And then Asher Cohn was elected to the city council in the 1860s and 1870s. So in the first 3 decades of Eudora, there was a Jewish person elected to the city council in each of those decades. Moreover, another city councilman was Frederick Dyckman. And while Dyckman was not Jewish, his wife was, and he threw in his lot, in a sense, with the Jewish community and identified with that community. We also have an example which concerns the origin of the Bene Israel cemetery. The city council voted to give 10 lots to establish the first cemetery in 1859 in Eudora. Abraham Summerfield, a councilman who was also a religious Jew, said that that would not help the Jewish community because traditional Jews would only be buried in Jewish-owned ground. So the council voted to provide the Jewish community with one of the 10 lots so they could have their own cemetery. That is not where, however, the cemetery came about, and I believe its present location came because one of Asher Cohn, Sarah Cohn's child died in birth, and he was buried on land owned by Asher Cohn and his partner Isidore Bernstein. When I say Asher Cohn, actually the land in both was owned by Asher and Sarah Cohn and Isidore and Sarah Bernstein, and the child was buried there. And I think the Jewish community eventually bought the 2 acres, and that's why it was established there. The Jewish community, however, was short-lived in Eudora. It lasted basically till the middle of the Civil War. It was the second organized Jewish community in the state, Leavenworth being the first. The Jews comprised a larger proportion of the community in early Eudora than in any Kansas town. Of the first 100 or so German-speaking settlers, probably 1/5 were Jewish. Most of them were members of the society, the Settlement Society in Chicago, and those who weren't tended to be relatives of members of the community. From the very beginning, they participated in civic and commercial life. They established a Jewish cemetery, and they organized themselves as the Bene Israel community, B-E-N-I, sometimes spelled B-E-N-E, and that really is the way German speakers would transliterate the Hebrew words B'nai Yisrael. B'nai means children of Israel, and so for them this B'nai or B-E-N-E or B-E-N-I is the way they would transliterate into German B'nai. In less than a decade from the start of Eudora, there were only two Jewish families that were left in Eudora in the 19th century. One was Asher and Sarah Cohn, and the other was Frederick and Henrietta Dykeman. Not until the post-World War II era would we know of any other Jews living in Eudora. When Kansas opened up for settlement in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that is settlement for non-Indians, you had abolitionists, slavery advocates, and many immigrants who were looking for cheap land. And the Chicago Company came, as most of you know, at the junction of the Wakarusa and Kansas rivers. Most of the settlers were part of the Chicago German-speaking immigrant society, who it said had 600 members who paid weekly dues to purchase land for farms and a new town. Very few of them actually came here after the company bought the land from Pascal Fish and a town site was laid out. Of the 29 heads of families who arrived in Eudora in 1857, 7 were known to be Jewish. Abraham Summerfield, who was a Chicago Company member, and his son Marcus, his wife Hannah, and their daughter Minna would follow soon. Asher Cohn and his wife came with their kin. On Asher's side, this included his half-brother Aaron Urbinsky, his half-sister Rosalie Urbinsky, and her husband Samuel Frischman. On Sarah Cohn's side was her sister-in-law Sarah Bernstein, who was an Urbansky, and her husband Isidore Bernstein. Those who were not part of the Chicago Company were relatives of the members. Then a whole group of Jews, 3 Phillips brothers, who were also members of the Chicago Association, Charles and Henrietta Kaufman Harbolt, and Harbolt died, and that's when the widow married Frederick Dykeman, which was rare for a Gentile and a Jew to marry at their time, and Adolphus and Eustace Erb and their children who moved from Illinois to Eudora. Most of the Jews were traders and looking for the town rather than most of the non-Jews who were looking for farmland in the area. Asher and Sarah Cohn owned a general store, which best would be called a country store. So throughout the 19th century, the general stores in Eudora were country stores. And if we look at Asher Cohn's store in the late 1860s and 1870s, most of the things that he sold were actually not sold for cash, but were traded. So they were actively buying grain and other things from farmers and would keep the books on that, and they were also selling. So they were shipping most of the grain, the corn and wheat and so forth elsewhere, but also in local produce and so forth, they would purchase from local farmers and sell to local people. So the pots and pans and manufactured goods and the coffee and so forth was not a large part of the country store. And that name country store again comes because they were mostly trading rather than the kind of 20th century retail store. And which also meant that you could bargain when you went in. We're uncomfortable bargaining. Maybe when we buy a car is the only time we bargain today. But the owner was behind the counter, and they would try to always offer a high price when buying, or they claimed, and would then sell as best they can. The Jews and Gentiles held Abraham Summerfield, the eldest of the Jewish settlers, in great respect. He was successful in business, elected to the first city council. He was the second postmaster in town, and his son Marcus was elected as city clerk. In 1862, Adolphus Erb and Frederick Deichmann, whose wife Henrietta was Jewish, were elected to the council, with Erb serving as chairman of the council. By 1865, however, these councilmen had moved on, but in 1869, Asher Cohen was elected to his first of what I've been able to figure 7 or 8 terms as a councilman. They saw themselves serving both Eudora and the Jewish community as well, and in the founding of the cemetery, which was important. Thus, the legacy that marks the Jewish presence and that Eudora has paid homage to is one, the Bnei Israel Cemetery, which everyone knew for 100 years, and now in the last decade, Asher Cohen's store, and commemorating him in terms of the Asher Cohen Park. Let me,
Moving on the computer, but not on the screen. My apologies. What's earlier? Here it goes.
I once gave a lecture at KU, the slide lecture, the AV person had dropped the slides. So it consisted of, you would have seen,
Yeah.
but
Read a lecture
fortunately.
like that.
Others,
Thought I just had to reset it. Yeah, just tap it lightly.
tap it lightly, okay. So this is an aerial view of the cemetery. How many of you have actually been at the cemetery? A few, okay. So this is the location, which at the time was out of town of Eudora, but on land that was owned by the Bernsteins and Cohens. Yes.
I've been doing research on historic trails in Douglas County, including the Oregon Trail. When I was in Baldwin City Library, I found a little pamphlet dating from 1976, the bicentennial on trails, and they had a picture of ruts from the Oregon Trail going right past the cemetery. That's fairly unusual. I was wondering if you might have any idea about how that came to be.
I don't.
They're
I
not
don't.
there now, I went and looked.
Yeah, I guess wagons didn't always stick exactly to the trail.
I know they did.
Going off for the night or looking for water and so forth, but,
Usually not,
pardon?
usually not.
This is the aerial view, and then, so this is the Bnei Israel, which the Jewish community in Lawrence has reverted to Bnei Yisrael, but it's the Bnei, this German, which was popular among both synagogues and other cemeteries from the 1840s to the 1870s, when many Jewish communities were predominantly German-speaking. This is Asher Cohen's tombstone, and on the left is the Masonic symbol, and many Jews were active in the Masons, and were active in Europe in the Masons because it was one of the few societies that admitted Jews. On the right, on the other side, is the hand spread, which is a sign of the priestly sign. And in Jewish ritual, when the priests give a benediction for the congregation, which is only done in Orthodox synagogues today, the benediction is given by people who are Kohanim. They are descended from the priestly class and are, we call them Kohens. Now, most people think I'm a Cohn because the name Katzman, like Katz or Cohn in France and so forth, generally indicates someone of the priestly class because it means coincidic, the K and the tzaddik. But under Jewish tradition, you're not allowed to assume that you're part of the priestly class. It must be passed from father to son, and my father and grandfather never claimed to be part of the priestly class, so I'm not. So when you go to a cemetery and see that hand spread, that's a symbol that someone is a descendant of the priestly class. Now, this is the tombstone of Aaron Urbanski. Aaron Urbanski and Asher Cohn were half-brothers. Their mother is buried in the cemetery, Sarah Urbanski. So her first husband was David Cohn, and her second husband was David Urbanski, who was Aaron's father. So they shared the same mother, and probably 2/3 of the burials up to the 1920s or more are people related to the Urbanski and Cohn family. So it is much a family cemetery as it is a community cemetery. And the Urbanskis had relatives in North Carolina, some named Urbanski, and we don't know why, some named Edwards. And there is an Edwards buried in the cemetery who is an Urbanski.
Interesting.
This is the tombstone of Emma Urbanski, who was the first wife of Aaron Urbanski. And she was a Woolman. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the name Woolman. In New York, Central Park and Prospect Park, there's the Woolman skating rinks.
Can you spell it?
Wollman. Okay? Now, also, one of her descendants was a person named Henry W. Block. Henry Woolman Block. So this is Emma Woolman, who was the first wife of Aaron Urbanski. And this is Jenny Urbanski, who was Emma's sister. So Emma died, and Aaron married his former wife's sister, which actually is according to Jewish custom. So that if, in fact, the sister had not been wed, did not have children, then there was almost an obligation for the widower to at least ask to marry. And so twice he married Woolmans, and Jenny Woolman was the second wife of Urbanski. This is the tomb of Sarah Urbanski, who was the mother of both Asher Cohn and Aaron Urbanski. As I said, her first wife was David Cohn, Asher's father, and second was David Urbanski, who was Asher Urbanski's father. Now this is the, let me keep that, tombstone of Isaac Cohn, and the top line is in Hebrew. It says, Hayeled Yitzchak bar Asher HaKohn. So a number of things. So while he's referred to as Isaac, he probably died within 8 days of birth, because according to Jewish tradition, a child does not have a name until the 8th day. So a boy is circumcised on the 8th day, never before, could be delayed but never before, and a girl is not have a naming ceremony till the 8th day. So we do not consider, in a sense, that birth yet a person. And so it's Hayeled, the child, and then they put Yitzchak, but because it starts with Yeled, it's giving that. And Bar, today in Hebrew we say Ben, but Bar was a term that was used traditionally as well as Ben in Hebrew. And Asher, and it says HaKohen, not Cohn, right? And that's the indicator that he is of that priestly class, the Kohen. And therefore, when Jews adopted names, and they adopted surnames late in the 1840s, many too chose colorful names like Blumenthal or Bloomingdale, and others might, like Katzman, HaKohen, indicating that they were of the priestly class. This I hope you're familiar with, is where next door, and in that store was Asher Cohn's store, his country store, and the plaque that has been put up to commemorate Asher Cohn. Now this is a letter that was written to the Israelite, which was a weekly publication founded by Rabbi Wise in Cincinnati. And it was written by Marcus Summerfield, a 16-year-old, because Rabbi Wise had announced his intention to start a Hebrew college in Cincinnati. And so what Marcus was doing was, one, making an appeal for someone to sponsor him to attend the Hebrew college. College, however, was 10 years away from being founded. And after he made that appeal, this ambitious young man, he then reported on the community. And so he talks that the community is at least formally 1 year old, because they've now elected Mr. Bernstein head of the community. They also, he announces that there will be a ritual circumcision, a bris, that will be held in a week, and that is actually Louis Cohn, who was born in 1860. So this is the evidence of the organized community in Eudora, and the degree to which the Eudora Jewish community saw themselves as both a part of Eudora and as part of the national Jewish community. They got the newspaper and they wrote to it. Yes?
You mentioned that,
If you talk a little louder.
I'm sorry, you mentioned, I think it was Asher, at the country store kept the books. Here's a young man who wants to go to college. Was the incidence of literacy higher among the Jewish population than general?
Very good question. Absolutely. So when you look at the early deeds in Eudora and in Douglas County, thanks to Quantrell, we don't have all the deeds. Many of them were destroyed. But when you look at those deeds, I have not found a single time when a Jewish person made an X, whereas maybe 20% of non-Jews transferring property signed with an X. Part of it is the literacy, the tradition of being part of the community, being able to read the Torah, to be able to participate in services. So children very early started to learn their letters, to learn Hebrew letters. For many of these, their primary language was Yiddish, which was written with Hebrew letters at the time. And so literacy was very high and very valued. One recent theory as to why that was so going back to biblical times, Jews have been the first group to move from agriculture to towns. There's much evidence of that in the Bible, and there's much evidence of that at the time. So Jews moved early, and therefore the skills of urban and town skills is literacy is very high. Yes.
When did that become true for women as well?
That's really interesting. We don't quite know, but we do. There is a thing called a geniza. So Jews traditionally, if the name of God was written on something, they did not destroy it, you buried it. The B'nai Israel cemetery has a geniza. So prayer books, which are no longer usable, you don't burn them or throw them away, you bury them. So there is a famous geniza in Cairo, which covers letters from 870 of the Common Era to about 1400. Literally tens of thousands of letters. Most of these Jews in the early Cairo were merchants. They would go out to the Far East and travel for a year or two. And they would correspond with their wives. And their wives would write back. So we have actual letters of women from the 9th and 10th century. This geniza was the back of a synagogue, and people would just throw the letters, because you'd have a greeting with blessing God and so forth. And this was discovered in the 19th century. And so probably 200,000 or 300,000 such letters are in archives in Cambridge and in New York, and spread out in other places. But those are the major collections. And that's our evidence of literacy. You will find Jewish women who were not literate, but that was rare. So that, and again, this notion as an urban group. So he reports on both the community, and in fact, when they're beginning to organize a community, there is a German language publication by the Israelite called Die Deborah, and so the first mention of the Jewish community is in 1858. That's published in Die Deborah. This is a portrait of Marcus Summerfield, probably 50 years later, when he was a professor of law at KU. He was the first Jewish professor. He didn't make the Hebrew University, but he was clerk of the Eudora City Council, and they hired him to collect debts on taxes and other things, and he earned enough money to go to Cincinnati Medical School, and then he did a residency at Columbia University the following year, came back to Lawrence in the 1860s. He hung out a shingle as a physician and as a moil, someone who did ritual circumcisions, and was elected coroner in Douglas County, and he remained a very important politician over the next years. He also became a lawyer. So he became a professor of law at the law school. So he had both law and medical degrees. Yes?
Who was a chancellor when he became a professor, when he started working for KU? What year was it?
He began to teach in the 1880s. I don't know who the chancellor was. Now this is a July 1863 column that the Israelite would acknowledge who had paid for a subscription to the Israelites. It's important for us in Eudora because on this line it says Reverend Isaac Stone, Eudora, Kansas. Stone was a rabbi in Quincy, Illinois, and briefly served as rabbi in Eudora in 1863, and then went back to Quincy. So that's our evidence that they've been trying to hire a rabbi for a number of years, someone who would be not just a rabbi, but a shochet, who would ritually slaughter meat. So this is in July of 1863. A month later, the Eudora community is advertising to hire immediately. So Stone has left. They want to replace him by the congregation of this city, a young man to officiate as shochet, to slaughter meat, one who is capable of acting as chazan, leading services on the high festivals. So the community itself can lead prayer on a daily basis or on the Sabbath. It doesn't need someone. But what they really need is someone to slaughter food and to replace Stone.
Excuse me.
However,
Where, did they have a synagogue here?
they advertised in the Israelite.
No, did they have a synagogue of Eudora?
No. In very few communities built synagogues. So Leavenworth is the first synagogue, and not until the 1890s would there be another. Most of these were merchants. The late 19th century are hard times, boom and bust in every decade. And Judaism does not require a synagogue, and in fact, the most common names for a synagogue are meeting place, as a Bet Knesset, or a house of study. So that it doesn't require in any way that space that traditional religions do.
Well, where would they
That was a
meet?
great question.
Would they meet in somebody's home then?
Right, so
Okay.
what was required at the time was 10 men making a minyan. There are certain prayers that cannot be said unless a minyan is present. By the late 20th century, many congregations count men and women, but at this time only men were counted, and so wherever it is. I've participated in minyans, let us say in a community store. So there are 3 services a day. In the middle service and the evening service, it may be any. If someone has died, you say a prayer for the dead, Kaddish, for traditionally 11 months. And you need a minyan, 10 men, to say that. So in large communities, the minyan might be just in someone's store, and people come. Traditionally, a lot of Jews have been in the civil service in Washington, and they used to publish a daily mimeograph form telling where there would be a minyan in what government building. So if anyone had to say Kaddish, you could do that, and it also reported on where you might be able to buy kosher food in some of the government buildings. So you don't need in any way a synagogue in order to do that. Part of the difficulty they have now in hiring anyone is the fact that the Jews are beginning to move. And not just Jews, some of the successful merchants in Eudora are going during the Civil War, because in this area of the country, merchants are doing well. You need to feed an army, right? So farmers are doing well in selling crops, and people in country stores are doing well in getting contracts to sell, and also in clothing. You have to clothe an army. And so for the first time, you're beginning to have mass-produced clothing, and in fact, your ordinary people are getting clothing in the army. So what you now begin to see is, here's Bernstein and Cohn, who had owned a general store in Eudora, and they pop up in 1863 in their new store in Lawrence. Okay, Lawrence is booming more than Eudora, despite the threat of raids, Price's raid first, and then Quantrill's raid later on. They're moving in, and all the things they're selling, cheap for cash.
Cheap for cash.
They'll sell anything, right? So that's one of the merchants. Another is Summerfield and Jacobs. Summerfield had been councilman in Eudora. Jacobs was his son-in-law. He married Minna Summerfield in Eudora, and their first child is born in Eudora, and they're Santa Fe merchants. So the trails are important to these, and they've moved in. And Summerfield and Jacobs will be turn into the major bakery in Lawrence till the 1890s. Not everyone leaves. So Frederick Dyckman, his wife is Jewish and has thrown in his lot with the Jewish community, is to remain both growing grain for his stock. He opens a butcher shop in Lawrence, but he's raising grain and he is buying and selling stock. And the next two generations of Dyckmans will be stock traders as well, which, by the way, even though Dyckman was not Jewish, was a traditional European Jewish occupation. And what you see here is Dyckman's acreage. And he and his wife continue to clear property throughout the century. And you also see here Marcus Summerfield owns. But he's not farming, he's leasing it out, whereas the Dyckmans are farming. And this is 1873. And in 1902, Dyckmans still own that land. They are the major, in fact, landholders in Lawrence, Kansas. Own a great deal of property. By 1902, Frederick Dyckman has been in a hospital for 5 years, incapacitated, so this land is being leased out. Henrietta Dyckman moves to Oklahoma, where her daughters are living, but they're still involved in that. And Dyckman owns a butcher shop, and when the Bernstein and Cohn store in Lawrence, which only lasts about a year, when they fold, Frederick Dyckman buys the store from them, and that will become his butcher establishment. And Asher Cohn, who never really has left Eudora, despite opening the store in Lawrence, returns and opens a store again in Eudora. Dyckman becomes a major name in Eudora. This is Dyckman's Crossing, which is near where the K-10, the old K-10 bridge used to be. And here's the old K-10, first of the old K-10 bridges.
Where is that?
So
today?
it used to be, when I would drive to Eudora
81st
on the K-10 before it became a highway, you'd cross over coming from Lawrence, you'd cross over that bridge and then make
So
a
like
right to go to the
Winchester State.
cemetery.
Like the bridge that's there now, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, there is a concrete bridge, but
Yeah.
it's been changed, the route, so it's not exactly where this would have been. The Dyckman holdings also locally were known as the Dyckman Grove. And organizations would hold picnics and other events on Dyckman's Grove. So it was a really well-known name in Eudora.
Do you know if this was a little more to the north or the south, or do you know?
Where it is now, I think a little more to the south than the current
Closer to the cemetery?
replacement, yeah. Now, there's a picture in the, around 1900 from the Topeka Capitol of Aaron Urbinski. So Aaron Urbinski had a general store in Eudora. He, in fact, is often attributed as to laying out the town of Eudora. He moves to Lawrence and opens a store there. That store in Lawrence lasts until the 1930s. But he moved to St. Mary's, Kansas, and becomes a dominant retailer in St. Mary's. And with various brother-in-laws, there's a very large family, again, many buried in Eudora, and owns stores in 5 or 6 towns and owns tens of thousands of acres. He's mayor of St. Mary's. 3 of his sons are mayors in St. Mary's. And he's in the news at this time because in the 1890s, he had lobbied to become the American minister to the Ottoman Empire, a position which was considered, quote, a Jewish position, like the minister Haiti, which was held by Frederick Douglass, was considered a black one. So, and Isidor Straus held it at one point, and so he lobbied for that because he was a Democrat and Grover Cleveland had been reelected. He was unsuccessful in that, but he was dominant in this area west of Topeka. These are 2 railroad passes. One on the top is signed by Elias Summerfield, who is Marcus's brother, Abraham's son, and the bottom is by Newman Erb, son of Adolph Erb, who was on the city council and chairman of the council in Eudora in the 1860s. So Newman Erb was the major Jewish railroad magnate in the late 19th and early 20th century. At one time, he was president of about 20 railroad companies. Elias was a major receiver of railroads and utility companies and an important Kansas politician. So these were among the wealthy and successful people out of Eudora. And this is Newman Erb's estate in Deal, New Jersey. He also had, quote, a camp in the Adirondacks, and he owned 2 what we might call mansions in New York City. Why Deal, New Jersey? There were only a few towns on the Jersey Shore before World War I that permitted Jews to buy land. Deal, Elberon, Seabright, and Long Branch were among the few. Wealthy Jews like Erb and the Guggenheim, Schiffs, Warburgs, Lehmans, Lobes could not buy property in a majority of towns. When I moved to Lawrence in 1969, we bought a house in 1970, and the deed said that Jews and blacks could not buy that property. Now, the court struck down covenants of that type in the late 1940s. But so Erb, with all his money and the mansions that he built and bought, still found himself that he could not buy in most areas. Now, this is Asher Cohn Park. I know of only 2 other parks honoring 19th century Jews in Kansas. There's an Abilene Park in Leavenworth, Kansas, and we would expect an Urbanski Park in St. Mary's. So Aaron Urbanski's wives, Leavenworth family, are remembered in the famous Woolman skating rink in New York Central Park and Prospect Park, and Eudora has done honor to one of its first settlers as its named not only this but other parks for people in the founding. And I think that brings a great deal of credit to Eudora. Any questions or comments? Yes.
It's early 20th century. I remember stories of my grandfather, who was a furrier in Kansas City, would get on his horse and wagon and come out here and buy pelts and things from the community out here. Do you know anything about that?
Absolutely. So among the first Jews in Kansas opening country stores, right? They are dealing in buying furs and trapping, and right, so they take the skins and they're going to sell them, just as then farming extends, they're gonna buy grain and so forth. So this is a very important industry that Jews. I might also point out that any of you who like leather ought to read sometime about what it takes to create leather. How the people who work on leather and handle it and handle skins are basically handling poison all the time, right? So in Europe, Jews can easily find work dealing with pelts and baking leather, right? And in the United States, Jews do it and blacks do it. It's work that's available, because if you have a choice, you're not gonna do it, right? So that becomes an important part. So when you look at early families in Lawrence, in Leavenworth, in Atchison, in Junction City, as settlement begins to go west, the Jews definitely, not only Jews, but Jews definitely are involved in skins and fur making and leather making as part of this trading. Great question, yes?
Do you have any idea from your research why they selected Eudora, not Leavenworth or Lawrence?
Okay.
Which would seem to be a more natural magnetic place.
Right. I basically would say they couldn't afford Lawrence or Leavenworth, right? So Leavenworth, because of the fort, is a city even before settlement is not open to non-Indians, right? Because you have the sutler, you have servicing the fort, so they're already traders there, just like a lot of people involved in Oklahoma before settlement opens up. So Leavenworth is the largest city. You need to have means to go there. And so in terms, I can tell you, the Jewish community, a lot are from St. Louis and are sponsored by relatives in St. Louis, but ordinary people. There is in fact a fight in Leavenworth about people who are squatters, who come in and take over some of the land. And Lawrence, because of New England immigrant society buying much of the land, it takes really, this is easily seen in terms of, for me, in my research, Jewish merchants, to understand that those who come to Lawrence first can't afford Leavenworth, right? And I always use an example. One of the people in Leavenworth, besides the Woolmans, Bloomingdale's first store is in Leavenworth. They make hoop skirts, and they then go back east and open up in New York City when they're successful. But so places like Eudora, especially for the company, they can buy that land. This Indian land, which now can be sold, that Pastoral Fish has gotten permission to be able to do that from the tribe. So buying a large quantity of land is cheaper. But even then, right, people have been paying a weekly fee in Chicago, but the lots are not given for free. The company has expended all its money in buying the land, so you still have to buy your lots and sections from the company. It's at a bargain price. So that's really why, in a sense. So Eudora has great potential, as again, at where two rivers meet and so forth. The Civil War is to radically change, in that sense, economic opportunity in the state. And even we always say, when the West is settled, the first thing a town wants is the state capital, right? If you don't get the state capital, anyone know what the next thing people wanted? The prison. And if you didn't get the prison, then maybe you go for the university. Right, they're looking for some economic basis. And so, great hope for Eudora, but in this area of the country, it's not true everywhere, but in this area of the country, where because of the border wars, because of the raids, because of the forts, the tremendous need, government procurement. And so the merchants boomed during the war. And that's to change everything. And that's why, in a sense, Eudora remains a major agricultural community, but not a major market community. And Lawrence doesn't start that way, but it becomes that way. It's a county seat. It has other advantages, closer to Leavenworth, to be able to feed the demand.
How many
Great.
identified grave sites are there in the cemetery?
I'm sorry.
How many identified grave
Okay,
sites?
so there were 27 burials up through the 1920s. And Lawrence did not know that Eudora had transferred the cemetery to Lawrence in 1869. It was forgotten. And so the merchants, the Jewish merchants in Lawrence, used the community cemetery. The one exception is Abraham Summerfield was first buried in the Jewish cemetery in Leavenworth, which has over 700 graves. And then his sons transferred his grave to Oak Hill Cemetery, the secular cemetery. The one thing that's interesting is the Cohn's daughter, Rachel, married a cousin of hers, David Passon. And she died in the 1960s. Her husband died in the 1940s. They chose not to be buried in the Eudora Cemetery, even though in a sense they were the keepers of that cemetery. They had the deed on it, but I speculate that they thought it would be forgotten and no one would ever come. So they chose to be buried not in a cemetery where almost everyone was related to them, but that secular cemetery at that point. And it was forgotten. My own personal involvement was when I came to Lawrence in '69, I had been dealing with WPA papers. And so I got a WPA inventory of Douglas County cemeteries. And in 1970 in the spring, I went to this seemingly abandoned Eudora cemetery. Then when I was president of the community in 1980, I initiated acquiring the cemetery. And I thought we had, but it turns out we hadn't, that it hadn't been complete by the lawyer who was supposed to do it. So Lenny Salkind and others in the late 1980s finished acquiring it. And then I discovered around 2000, 2005, that the community already owned it. That Lawrence Jewish Community incorporated in 1869, called itself the Bene Israel Congregation in order to accept the transfer of the cemetery. So Lawrence has owned it since 1869, even though they didn't know it at the time. But yes, a few stones had to be restored. There are about 15, unlike Asher Cohn, but like the Yeled, the Cohn child, which had been redone in the 1950s and 60s when B'nai B'rith in Kansas City became involved. And it's interesting because there are some mistakes in the Hebrew. So there's a man, Katzenstein, Aaron Katzenstein, buried there, and instead of a Kaf, the first letter K, it's a Mem. So it reads Matzenstein, because someone had printed it out and either made a mistake or the person who cut it lost it and did it. So But all the graves are known. And as I said, I've been able to track who everybody is.
Great. Thank you.
I might ask you one other thing. So one of the things we know if someone is visiting, the Jewish custom is that you leave stones on a tombstone when you visit a cemetery. It commemorates the person, and so we know if people have been out there because people put stones on it.
So is it still used today? Like people, I think I seen recently they had a funeral out there.
Yes. I have too many friends buried there, and I attend funerals there regularly,
So how many graves are there currently then? You said 27 up
There
until,
were 27, and I would estimate maybe today there are 70 or so. And, you know, I have good friends, Sig and Lorraine Lindemau, who are buried there. Sig was on the Kinder Transport. And we used to argue when we acquired it, neither of our wives wanted to be buried in Eudora. They would say, who's gonna visit? And, you know, one of the things we used to argue over, well, my wife said, I'm not gonna be buried there, over my dead body. But the point is that I grew up in New York when 1/3 of the Jewish population lived there. Today, those cemeteries are empty. Who's gonna visit them? Jews have dispersed, like other people have throughout the United States. So it's places like Eudora Cemetery that are visited, and it's these large Jewish cemeteries in the New York area that are not visited very often.
Interesting.
So,
I don't see we'll have to document after we
Yeah.
just take out a quick question. Is there something, what's up with the stone?
A little louder.
What's up with the stones tradition? I've seen other, I think it's beautiful and wonderful, you see other incursions of Stone Age life in the Hebrew Bible. Jacob sees the ladder, the angels are coming down, next morning he sets up a stone, right? I mean, it's this continuation of lithic sensibilities into the modern time.
right, my kids grew up in Lawrence in the only Shomer Shabbos family, that observed the Sabbath. And so in our Sabbath table, especially on Saturdays we would sing psalms and other things from the Bible that have been set to music over hundreds of years. And my kids who went to Jewish camps and stuff would come back and sing some of these traditional psalms using a popular song that was popular that year and #1 on the hit parade. And that keeps that tradition alive. So it's both the involvement of the secular and the religious world and moving it. And so that, and it's clear, though Jewish merchants weren't able to keep the Sabbath, that this Eudora community was primarily an Orthodox community. Despite the fact they advertised in a Reform publication for rabbi, but one of the things that I and my research show that it wasn't so much Reform, but the Israelite, the American Israelite, circulated to the Midwest. So the truth and the real key to circulation of Jewish newspapers was regional and city rather than by denomination that they were affiliated with.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Any other questions? Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katzman. Meeting adjourned. We'll see you guys at the next meeting, the Sunflower meeting. If you guys like to attend that, thank you.
Thank you. Great questions.
So my Zadie Lewis Press.
I'm sure we will, yes, thank you.
It started in Kansas City, Kansas.
At,
Ended up being open in Shalom.